Hello and welcome to the Global Journalism Seminar Series at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. I'm Mira Salva, I'm Director of the Journalist Fellowship Programme. It's May 2021 and we've passed the first anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's clear that this is going to be a long fight, and the front line of this fight is currently in India. And I want to say, first of all, that our thoughts are absolutely with all those who've lost people they love and those who are unwell, especially in India, but everywhere at the moment. It really is a global tragedy. It feels particularly important now as ever to hear from those directly on the ground reporting on this story and doing the work that makes it so important for us to understand what's going on. And it's a real honor to have Manisha Pande, Executive Editor of News Laundry, with us today.
Hi.
Hi, Manisha. The media sector is not at all good at analysing itself anywhere in the world, really. And so outlets that take a critical look at journalism, as well as doing excellent journalism themselves, are really to be cherished. And in India, that's News Laundry. Founded in 2012, it was the first subscription-driven outlet in a country with a complex and noisy media ecosystem that we'll come on to in this seminar. And in many ways, Manisha's work defines News Laundry. She's the writer and co-host of a weekly satirical show, TV Nuisance, and she has also won awards for her reporting on politicians' misuse of public funds. Manisha, thank you so much for joining us today. There's a huge amount to talk about. And thank you all for joining us as well. And if you have questions for Manisha or for me, please type them into the Q&A box and I'll put them to her throughout the seminar. Manisha, let's start with reporting the pandemic, which has been a challenge for journalists all over the world. It's been a story that's been very hard to access, and it's been a story where many governments have fairly or unfairly made it hard for journalists to get to the field, to kind of access the data they need and to do the reporting they need. Could you talk us through a little bit what it's been like in India?
Yeah, so right up, this is a really depressing time for journalists in India, and it's really hard to be a journalist in India right now because just over the last 1 year, we've lost more than 150 journalists to coronavirus. And just last month, we've lost about 85 journalists. News Laundry, also, we lost a colleague to COVID. And these are, again, not official numbers. This is being collated by a research organization called Rate the Debate. They've just done it independently by speaking to various media organizations, checking newspaper reports. So the virus right now is really a lived reality. The fear of the virus is a lived reality for journalists. You know, you're either grappling it with yourself or you have a family member that you have to take care of. And with the complete breakdown in system, it means that journalists are really living the horror stories that ordinarily they have to report on. Add to that, I think the last 1 year has been extremely stressful financially for a lot of us journalists here because revenue models have shrunk, advertisements have shrunk, so that's meant a lot of pressure on mainstream big media organizations and smaller organizations because there are no advertisements. Typically, there are two ways through which you make your revenue. It's either advertisements or events, and both have shrunk. And this has led to massive layoffs, again, unreported, undercounted layoffs and huge salary cuts. I mean, I have colleagues of mine who say that, in different other news organizations saying that, we've gone back to our 2016 salaries. And journalism in India is anyway, it's very hard to make money, it takes time. So for a lot of them, it's as if the last decade didn't exist for them, one journalist told us. So there's the fear, there's the physical threat of the virus, there's the financial stress of reporting with fear of layoff, being laid off with your, and your salary cuts. And then there is reporting on the pandemic. Now, I think one of the chief features of the current government and some state governments in India has been an almost obsessive commitment to opacity, not putting data out, not taking questions from journalists. We have a prime minister who's still not given us a press conference. Mostly what he does is he gives scripted interviews to star news anchors. This is usually before elections. So we still haven't had a press conference, and that's really the kind of the message that's sent from the top, that we don't have to really respond to journalists' questions. So with the pandemic now, just to give you an example right now, is there's really complete, there's no proper data being gathered on the number of deaths. And there's a lot of underreporting, and we know this because we have reporters on the ground. News Laundry has 4 reporters right now in Uttar Pradesh, one of the most populous states in India. And just to give you an example, between April 19th and April 30th, there's a city called Meerut in Uttar Pradesh. This is again one of the most populous districts in Uttar Pradesh. They recorded about 36 deaths. This is between April 19th and April 30th. And when our reporters went there, they went to a crematorium, the largest there. They found that there have been 264 cremations with COVID protocol in that period. So from 36 to 264. Now, what's happening with this? I just want to quickly, I want you to also jump in. I don't want this to be a monologue, but I just want to quickly say that because of a lack of data, journalists are having to do this morbid job of checking what the government is saying with, the reality on the ground, which is visiting crematoriums, seeing how many people are being cremated with the COVID protocol. And again, the problem is that not everyone's being tested, and we don't have numbers on how many people are being tested. So this is again an assumption that if someone's cremated with the COVID protocol, they're likely to have COVID. So that's been a huge challenge, I think, in the second wave.
I mean, this must be incredibly hard on journalists themselves. How are you supporting your reporters, for example, in the field? Because this is a kind of, like you said, it's a very gruesome, horrible way to...
Very hard, and we have very young reporters. And I'm constantly in awe of the young reporters who've joined journalism over the last 2 years, because in the past 1 year, there's been a riot in Delhi, a very, very, gruesome, deadly kind of a conflict between Muslims and Hindus. Essentially, this was after protests on the citizenship bill. I don't know if your audience knows about that, but the long and short of it, there was a riot in Delhi, which they covered. And this was around the same time when Trump was visiting India. And then came the pandemic and this migration that happened of unorganized labor from the cities back to the villages, because it was a brutal lockdown. So young journalists have, they've reported on a riot, they're reporting on pandemics and deaths. And often, journalists at my age, I'm 35, we go through our life without having reported on either, often. So there's a lot of, they're having to face these things very hard on, and, very like, it's in their face. So I think what we're doing with our reporters is, for the beginning, and because we're a smaller organization, we can do this. And our focus is also a lot on reporting on the media. Very clear to them was that you don't have to step out if you're not confident, because they're very young. So we made sure that a lot of organizations had this issue where editors were telling them, you have to go and it's fine. And, life goes on, you have to report on the field, even if it's a pandemic. But I think we took a conscious call of making sure that, we don't push people. We also tell them that at some point we will have to report, and that's our job. We do it carefully. We do it with all the possible care, but we didn't push them. And then I think having a lot of personal conversations with reporters have helped us, because we're a small team. So the editors have been very accessible to their, issues. Every time and we've also been very clear about the fact that if you are showing any symptoms, just reach out to us. We'll figure your medical care, we'll figure your tests, we'll help you out in every possible way. So that's a huge burden. I think for a lot of journalists and big media organizations, just falling sick, under normal circumstances, is a huge burden if you have an illness which can be prolonged. So there's also the stress of falling sick, then having those, you're almost made to feel guilty if you're going to be 2 weeks off. Yeah. So most journalists are, they almost feel like they're doing something wrong. And especially like I said, at a time of layoffs and salary cuts where you're being really watched and your worth is being really measured. So I think that's also another thing that's been hard for journalists. But for us, a lot of conversations and making sure that we take them through the reporting process, talk to them, and also not push it, because this is new for even us, even as editors, it's really new for us to send out young reporters on the field with such a pandemic.
I mean, it made me smile when you said you described yourself as 35 and also not young, because to me that's still like, young journalist. But do you feel...
Young journalists like 20...
I know, it's the old world and the new world definitions of youth. Have you... I think there's an issue about journalists being sent out to cover protests, riots, pandemics, again, the world over, where the kind of the trust between the public and the media and the way journalists are viewed where they used to be viewed as neutral participants or people who could possibly be there to help, and now they're seen as somehow either part of the establishment or somehow part of the enemy in some way, can make it harder for journalists. Again, what have you found?
So it's really, I mean, it's in a very morbid sense. It's nice to hear you say this, because this makes me feel, oh, we're not alone.
Mm.
There are other journalists in the world grappling with the same sort of issues. So I'll tell you, look, we've had two major protests, the citizenship protest and the farmers protest. And you've had a large section of the mainstream media, which is the television media. Let's just call it television media, which is based in the National Capital Region. It's usually English and Hindi, and it has huge reach. And these are also large business houses. So this is really big legacy media. Has most of it through prime time, say from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, your news time, have decided to just be mouthpieces of the government. So any view that counters the government view, or any view that challenges the government view, or any form of dissent, is immediately labeled as anti-national. And you're immediately labeled as a troublemaker, and then there are all sorts of fake news propaganda around you that will be aired nightly on the prime time by some of the most famous news anchors, the most popular news anchors with maximum reach. Not all of them, but most of them. In these protests, what has happened is that most of these protests from the very beginning have been demonized by primetime news anchors who have maximum reach. And protesters have often felt very sidelined. And if you go to these protests, the most amusing thing that we found, and I've covered one of them personally, and the other one were my reporters went to the farmers' protest, is that there are two enemies, the government, and then there's the media. And often they're more angry with the media than with the government. And it's not their fault.
Can I just interrupt you to just outline very quickly what these farmers' protests were about?
This was basically against the farmers' bills that were passed, and they weren't passed with any consultation. And chiefly farmers from Punjab, Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and Rajasthan. These are northern Indian states and very dependent on agriculture. Congregated. There were protests happening in these states, but finally they decided to make it to Delhi because they wanted to be heard. They felt the central government was ignoring their demands. So they came to Delhi and occupied a space, basically, to have their demands heard. And these were farmer unions from mostly the three states that I mentioned. And again, so from the very beginning, these farmers were, they were told, they were called, they were dubbed as troublemakers. One of the states from where a large section of the farmers came has had a problem of insurgency back in the 80s. And so it was very, so what the media did was color it as like the separatist movement, or, hark back to the 80s when there was a lot of violence in that state. So making those correlations when none existed. So farmers felt very cornered, because when they switch on the TV, all you saw was not what you wanted, not your demands, or what your objective was to come here. And again, the main objective was to be heard by Delhi, the New Delhi government, and the media also, because it's really like, it's a very symbiotic relationship. We'll talk about that later, but yeah. So there was a lot of anger against the media for not voicing their concerns, and not just not voicing their concerns or ignoring them, but dubbing them as this evil that's descended onto Delhi. And then again, using fake news to tar them all, or using propaganda like, it could be something as silly as, the traditional outlook that we have, the cliche of a farmer is supposed to be a poor man who's, scrawny, not eating and all that. But obviously that's not true, that's changed. So, you'd have stupid television programming like, oh, look at these farmers eating pizzas here. They're just really well-to-do and they just come here to party. And they're not even, do they even look like farmers? They speak in English. Of course, farmers' children, they have the right to educate their children. A lot of them have gone even abroad and educated themselves, come back and joined farming. And it is, in Punjab, at least, it is a business which is still primarily the mainstay. But yeah, so these kind of things were being said at a very personal level. And then, of course, starring the whole movement as this anti-national secessionist movement, which is basically anti-India, which doesn't recognize that these laws that are going to be passed are actually for the benefit of India. So these people who are out to stop the growth of India. So this is the kind of narrative you'll hear on television news for almost, I think, 2 to 3 months, almost. And the one interesting thing is also that while India, after the first wave and the numbers started dipping, coronavirus was often just brought up in television media to question protests. So India was by and large going about its business. I mean, shops were open, businesses were open, schools were beginning to open, some of them. Festivals were going on as usual, religious congregations were happening as usual, but coronavirus was often used as a boogie to just quell protests and say that during a pandemic, how can these guys congregate like that? And so, because there was so much propaganda coming their way, I think also what we found when we were there was the farmers felt that the coronavirus was actually a conspiracy of the government to stop their protests. So, there was just so much mistrust. But coming back to the media, so we had some very interesting conversations with farmers who were present there, very articulate conversations with my colleague Nidhi was there on the field along with Basant and Akanksha. And often media would be a huge point of debate, and there would be a lot of anger towards the media and anger towards journalists, suspicion towards journalists. And the sad part was that I think a lot of these channels, it's usually the primetime anchors who do these things, and these are people who will never step out of their studios. So between 8 to 10 o'clock is when they'll come, they'll rant, and they'll just peddle the government propaganda and go back home. But these channels have reporters who report on the ground, who are not doing these things, who are actually just doing, you can say that they're collecting news to fill up till the anchor comes and takes over with the propaganda. So through the day, you have, reporters just, those reports are nearly never shown on prime time. I mean, for most channels, for most of the rabid channels at least. So you would have people heckling these reporters. So it also became dangerous, and sometimes it would get quite extreme, where they'd heckle them, or they'd even like rough them up a bit, beat them up a bit, scare them away, shoo them away, or refuse to talk to them. So at one point, I do understand the anger against the media and the suspicion, but it's also, from a media point of view, it's very scary to see how people were looking at media as the enemy, and chasing down reporters, not wanting to engage with them for no fault of theirs. They've been victims of propaganda, but it's also really, it's something to think of as a media professional, that this is really dividing us into what we don't want to be divided into.
I mean, we talk a lot about media diversity, and certainly in India, we've had former fellows look at the issue of caste in newsrooms, but I'd also be interested to know about the kind of the regional diversity, because you talk about creating the narrative of farmers being either troublemakers or annoyed that they don't fit a stereotype of a small, scrawny.
It's very interesting because this is mostly true for, like I said, the most of the mainstream legacy media channels in Delhi, which is English and Hindi, and from that I'd say at least 2 or 3 channels would not fit into that category. But the farmers would actually tell us that if you want to learn journalism, learn from Punjabi media, which is, the farmers that we met from Punjab, because they have been really talking about our issues. And there will also be this comical situation where one brand, for example, a Z News, would have a Hindi channel, which is peddling this propaganda, but they also have a regional entity or Punjabi channel, a language entity, which would be the Punjabi, news channel, which will not be able to do what the Hindi channel is doing, because they're way closer to the people. Reporters there are, it's their neighbors probably who are going for the protest. They know someone who's sitting in the protest. So reporters have also come from that community. So it's very hard for them to demonize their own people. So you'd have the same channel, but very different kind of coverage between what they were doing in Delhi to what they were doing in locally. So I think now this is again a very complex kind of thing to explain, but in this pandemic, for sure, language press has been quite good. It's been much better than, I won't say much better, but in terms of newspapers, I'd say that they are doing a lot of the work.
And why is that? How has that come about? So they're closer to the ground, or they're more?
Something that even I've been thinking, because you have one newspaper which has been very pro-government, and it's been pro-establishment, and suddenly during this second wave of the pandemic, we are seeing reports coming out on the front page or the city pages, really questioning the government's narrative, questioning the government's agenda. This is something that we've been talking about this in the newsroom, that what is changing in some of these newspapers. Some are just the same, but there are some channels, some newspapers that have shifted. I think maybe because it's really hard to now look away from what's happening in India. We are at 3.79 million active cases. We've had 3,700 deaths. These are just official numbers. When our reporters are on the ground, four of my reporters, like I said, in Uttar Pradesh, they're devastating stories, and in hospitals, scramble for oxygen, scrambling for beds, crematoriums full, huge anger again. Like, we have a few videos that our journalists shot and sent it back. Again, abusing the media, literally, like, you're not. And there are other independent organizations also that have reported this on. So yeah, I think, to answer your question, I think maybe because it's hitting home and it's too hard to ignore. So I think it's only the guys in the studio now who are not stepping out at all that can go on with parroting the government narrative on the pandemic. But reporters who are on the ground, and reporters who are seeing things, and even news organizations that are smaller, maybe situated in in smaller cities or smaller villages and towns, have to face up to what's happening, because it's really hard to avoid. But yeah, I don't have an answer to why exactly this is happening. Something that we've been thinking of.
You talk about the international media's coverage. There's been some kind of criticism of the kind of slightly voyeuristic coverage of the deaths and the crematoriums and the burning, the kind of live burnings, and also a kind of almost an Orientalist framing of, the poor country where bad things happen, even though this is a global pandemic and has hit several Western countries very hard as well. Do you think the international coverage has been fair?
I think it's been by largely very fair and very accurate and eye-opening and very necessary. And I think they're often able to say the things that Indian media will not be able to say. Even if an Indian news channel has a report which is as powerful as what the BBC is doing, the anchor in India will not be able to use that report powerfully enough to question the media. To question the government of the day. So again, it gets lost in that 8 to 10 p.m. slot. But I think with foreign news channels, they're being able to ask more pointed questions, because obviously they're not under the same sort of pressures that Indian news channels may be in. I think, this whole crematorium thing, it's just to scare away the foreign media, because I think this is a criticism if you throw at someone who's not from India, and especially if you're a white person, you immediately feel like, okay, I don't want to hurt any sentiments. I don't want to, step on any boundaries. So I think it's just a tactic devised to just stop people from reporting. There can be two arguments to this. There is the aesthetics of reporting from a crematorium or a graveyard, where you have to be sensitive that this is it's a very personal moment of grief. A lot of people are grieving. You have to be very careful on how you invade that space, that privacy. You have to be very careful on how you approach people with your mic, with your camera, especially if you're doing a video story. You can't just go shoving your mic at someone. You can't just start reporting someone without their permission. So there are those issues of how do you approach, how sensitive can you be, what are you really trying to show? Like you said, sometimes it can be sensationalist or like you said, Orientalist. But I think that is just because the image of a crematorium is just striking. It's just a ground burning is just striking. So, maybe there is some sort of exoticization there, but I don't think that's a problem. So yeah, there's the aesthetics of how do you approach a situation like this, which every journalist should think of, Indian and foreign. We also, have multiple conversations in our organization. How do you approach someone who's grieving? What are sort of permissions you need before you start recording them? Do they know the impact sometimes of what they're going to say on the camera? So sometimes that also becomes important, because if a video goes viral, it can change a person's life in a way that they don't predict. So I at least am very careful about, do they know the impact of, what will happen once they're on my show or whatever. The second argument of do not go to the crematoriums and it's against Indian culture or Hindu culture is crap, because we've done that a lot of times. We've had right from Gandhi to some of the recent prime ministers, their cremations have been beamed live telecast. So this is not a question of you're offending Hindu sensibilities. This has happened all the time, and there's no such. To my mind, I think it makes a lot of sense to be there, simply because, like I said, we're not getting accurate data from governments. So how do you really evaluate what's happening on the ground? But yeah, visually, I do think that there's some not concern, but I think there's some thinking one must do before they venture into a place, and how they approach it.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the questions now, and if people do have questions, do please type them into the Q&A. The first one from Dolapa Aina. We talked about the kind of the anchors parroting the party line, but then more independent reporting outside the studios in many ways. But the question here is: are journalists in India being made to water down their reports of government mismanagement of the pandemic? Are there pressures on you?
There are definite on independent media, online platforms, and so this is how it works.
What are the types of pressures here? Yeah.
There's definitely, there's a huge problem of self-censorship. And that was something also that's pointed in the World Press Freedom Index with India. There is an assumption also in Indian newsrooms, I'd say Delhi newsrooms, that if you do a certain story, it's going to result in immediate backlash, and you don't want that backlash, so you just don't publish it. So there's one part of how we are censoring ourselves, which is just killing the story before it even reaches the editors. Then there's the point of where the editors kill the story because they know that something like this is going to get them in trouble with proprietors, or if they know that something like this could hurt their business interests. Again, in India, with legacy media, with big media organizations, they also have other business interests other than the media. So it could be education, which means that to stay in the other businesses, they have to be in the good books of the governments, either state or center. So that's a balance that they're always trying to make. And so yeah, the other part is where the editor will say, okay, this is just not worth it. We're not going to carry the story. And then of course there are calls then that may come from the proprietor after a story is published to be told to not do it, or to be just also, I think with now it's also really clear instructions on what you can do, what you cannot do. I think there's a broad understanding. So yes, journalists are having to water down what they write, but within mainstream media, newspapers, and even sections of television news reporters, reporters still are finding ways to tell stories. So that's interesting because some of the most compelling stories that I have read are actually, sometimes they're on television and they're in a channel which is very pro-government, but it's this one reporter who's doing the story, or even in newspapers. But what's happening is that story will never be used by the anchors, like I said, pointedly in the prime time to question the government, or to really, if not question the government, but to then really highlight it strongly. So I think, yeah, that's broadly.
These are kind of two sets of pressures. It's kind of, one is like interpersonal pressures, really. It's self-censorship and exploiting the relationships of personal contacts between owners and politicians and proprietors and editors, senior editors. And then the other one is a kind of lack of data, just a kind of blankness. So it's not, it's not what we're
And then we've had newspapers who've published articles, reports, investigative reports that have not made the government look good, and then they've lost ads. They've not got ads for the next 1 month or so. So then it just, then it's no one really telling you, but you know.
There is weaponization of advertising.
Like I said, one of the more, the other ways of earning revenues is events, right? So a lot of media organizations will hold conclaves. And if for those conclaves, for some reason, you do need a cabinet minister or the prime minister to come and inaugurate or whatever, so they won't come. And that's how you get your big sponsorships. So, if you do something that isn't going with the government's line of scheme of things, they'll just say we won't come for your for your big conclave, for which you need big sponsors to keep going. So that's another way.
That's far more blunt. Question from Malva, one of our journalist fellows from Nicaragua, about, again, sticking to the issue of lack of data, because she says in Nicaragua also we don't get accurate data about COVID, so we have to find other ways of getting some information, like staying in the hospitals, counting coffins, talking to people. How do journalists keep safe when reporting this, and what advice would you give for other journalists covering COVID and emergencies?
With the death toll that we've suffered over the past 1 month, I'm really beginning to think, for us at an organizational level, we did take the call that it's not, it's just not worth it, because it's really hard. And, we're hearing so many stories of there just being no beds, and we're reporting these stories. So for us, we have to take the conscious decision of, do we want to add on to this? And will we be able to help a colleague? You can't send someone out on the field to report, but you want to make sure that when they're safe and that you're able to help them just in case they do get the virus. So to answer your question, right now in the current situation that we're in, honestly, it's hard to implement this for bigger media organizations because they have to go about gathering news. But I think some of them have devised ways of talking on the phone, doing it on, doing it on the internet. A lot of them filing stories on the internet. But I think right now we're at that point where journalists also need to just know that there's no point being too brave about this. You've got to keep safe, and if it's the pandemic is exploding in the way that it is, you have to worry about your safety first, and that's something that we tell our journalists too. Of course, you have to be cautious, like double masking and stuff like that. So some of our journalists who've gone already contracted it, and they just tested negative, and then they were itching to go back to the ground, so they left for the ground. But so that makes you feel a little at ease, because okay, they've at least they've just tested negative. But broadly, yeah, I mean, basics we know of, masking up, gloves, sanitizing, and stuff like that. But I would say, if your country is going through what we are right now, I think journalists have to care about themselves and figure ways of. And there's been some stellar reporting, by the way, uh, through making phone calls and doing good old internet research, not going on the ground, but just really doing hardcore reporting by digging up sources, calling people up and stuff like that.
I mean, on that, has kind of user-generated content or social media helped at all with that, inform that reporting?
User-generated content, I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
No, not to my mind.
Okay. Can we go to kind of news laundry in particular? So you have an interesting business model, and a question for Peter Adeli, who runs 444.hu in Hungary, and saying, could you talk a bit about your funding model, specifically the role of audience revenues in an environment where I imagine there's some government interference on the business side of things? Because a lot of what you talked about, the weaponization of advertising revenue, the phone call to senior editors, are something our colleagues in Eastern Europe will recognize as being very familiar.
So, I think because we started off as a media critique platform, we recognized very early on that the big problem with the media was the business model. Just doesn't make sense for us to be in a profession that's essentially public service, but it's funded by advertisements. And there's just a massive conflict of interest in taking money from those who you have to report on, basically governments and corporations. Those are the two main people who, keep your news organizations going. So if I have to report on the current government, I cannot do it as bravely and honestly as I can if I'm worried of the repercussions that are going to, repercussions of the report I do. If I know the ads are going to get blocked, or if I can't do a particular story on a particular corporation because, I'm not going to get ads from them. And again, corporate advertisements are a big part of the revenue too. So we recognize this very early on, that journalists are sometimes not as compromised. It's the model that's really flawed and makes them compromise. So our founder and our CEO, Abhinandan, was very militant about this fact that we're not going to go down the same route, because we're critiquing this constantly. If we are to set up something and if we are to do our independent reporting, it has to be powered by people. And so we started off with subscriptions really with that mindset. We're a small newsroom, and we're growing now, really. And last 2 years have been really good for us, subscription wise. We've really seen that people are seeing value in paying for news, or at least people are understanding that this is something that cannot be just, 2 rupees a paper, or this cannot be something free. People are seeing value and why you may have to pay to keep news free, like we say. But we've been hammering this message for a while now, and it's working for us. But I think that really it comes from the fact that we were critiquing media so early on, and we figured what the flaws were, and we didn't want to go down the same route. So we thought that if we want to do this, we have to figure out a subscription model. I think more and more people are realizing. And of course, it's easier when you're a small newsroom. We can't be a newsroom of scale. We can't compete with the Times of India and have like 50 reporters across the country, or I don't know, 20 reporters, in a state, or I don't know, 5, 6 in some other state. Not 20 is too much, but yeah. So we can't have that. But we can still tell great stories being small, and we can do it fiercely because we are supported by our subscribers. And that's really important to us. So I think even for big media, eventually you will have to figure out a mix of ad and subscriptions. You can't and India is still lagging behind in that. But I think eventually you will have to come to a point where you will have to figure out how do you, try and get more people to subscribe to you. Less dependence on, advertisements, basically.
And how are you kind of getting out this message about subscriptions? Is it through newsletters? Is it through social media?
Oh, so so we've had this slogan, pay to keep news free, for a very long time. And yeah, so we did it initially with a lot of video content. So, cheeky videos, fun videos, telling them about what we're doing and why you need to do. And also some amount of, this required some amount of media literacy too, telling people that, why are you getting the news that you're getting? Whose purpose is the news serving? Is it serving your purpose? Is it serving the public's interest, or is it serving, this corporation's interest? Why is this particular news being blacked out from your news? Why did you not get this news? What are the conflicts of interest that led to this news disappearing from your newspaper? So I think we did a lot of that kind of reporting. So that helped us hammer the point on why you need to, devise a model which is independent of these, issues. And then, of course, now it's a lot of video content. It's a lot of reporters on the ground while reporting. Every time they report, they tell, we thank our subscribers and say it's because of you that we've been able to do this. And I'll tell you, Meera, like our election coverage was completely funded by people.
Okay.
We had 3 states and 1 union territory go up for elections just the previous month. We had reporters in these places. And this is hard for a small organization to do, right? Because again, we can't, sending a reporter there, stationing them for a month, conveyance, everything costs a lot of money. It's a lot of money that we need to think of, but we were able to completely have people funded, and it worked wonderfully. And I think, so yeah, a lot of newsletters, a lot of video content, a lot of driving home the point why there's value in it. And of course, offering products which are valuable.
It's really interesting. Kind of endlessly fascinated by this. Who is subscribing? Are they kind of older, younger, men, women, urban, rural?
So unfortunately, mostly men. I'm a little upset with that. We do have fewer women than we'd like, but it's younger. I think 35 would probably be the average age. I'm guessing. I'll have to check that with our guy. And a lot of them are also, some of them at least, not a lot of them, some of them are not based in India. So these are people who want to stay in touch with India and the news back home, and they don't know where to look for news. So they come to News Laundry. It's also a discerning audience we have because we've been doing media critique. So it's also an audience that is typically consuming a bunch of other stuff, but then they come to us because they want to know particular things and they want a wrap of what really they should be looking at. So, and one thing is podcasts.
Okay.
Our podcasts are most subscribed to products. People do really, what we've seen is that people do really want to pay for podcasts because I think it's just a sticky medium. I think you just, I think you form an association with a journalist in a way that you don't in other mediums with podcasts, I feel. I mean, that's my sense. So a lot of people also subscribe to our weekly podcast, which is like a wrap of the news, and it's just the News Laundry editorial team chatting about the news. So it gives them a wrap of what's happened, along with our views on it. And we started off as because we were a subscription-based model. We started this podcast off because we wanted to be transparent with our subscribers, to tell them where our biases lie, where are we coming from, what are our inclinations. So you know who your people are, who are giving you news, or who are in charge of really this organization. And it started off as an exercise in transparency, and then it really shot up. I think it really became popular, and people like to listen to us and get their news. So that's one of the popular reasons why people subscribe to us.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Do have some water because I know I made you switch off your fan because of the noise. Sorry. Question from Zoe Sierra in Zimbabwe. You point out a lot more young journalists are in the field, and has this changed the style of reporting, the kind of sources that they use, the point of view? And you mentioned News Laundry has been very, very good with short videos. How much is the kind of youth production values changing?
So in terms of videos, definitely. See, newspapers, even if they're younger reporters, is a set format, right? You can't be that, let's say, innovative in how you tell your story with a newspaper because there's a constraint of word count, the columns, and you have to fit the story in a certain space. And there's a format. You can't be irreverent or whatever with newspapers. But I think in video, a lot of journalists, you've had long form reports also, like, just like a 40-minute video on, say, a inside the farmer protest kind of a thing. You've also had shorter stuff like 8 minutes, 7 minute stuff. But I think younger reporters come with a certain earnestness and freshness that maybe more seasoned TV news anchors don't have. It's more affected the way they report. I think younger journalists are more keen on just listening and just allowing the subject to speak sometimes. And that's really refreshing. So in formats, I think the style is maybe different. Yeah, I could say the style is more casual, more irreverent. It's not, and it's not formulaic. And there's not a formula. Like TV news always has this formula that you have to show this, that, then you have to have the sticker, and then you have to have this, thing saying, and you have to have a little bit of drama or some music or whatever. So we're seeing a lot of younger journalists on online YouTube platforms change that format a bit.
I mean, it strikes me, you talked about how difficult it is to be a journalist and the kind of falling salaries, but sites like yours and the Scroll, and the Wire are offering also a chance for real innovation in journalism. And just a question from Adele Santelli in Brazil: how do you think the future of journalism in India is going to be affected by what's happening now? And do you think, for example, that young people will still want to become a journalist? Is it still an appealing?
I'm always, in fact, like when I go to colleges or universities or speak to students, I almost feel like dissuading them, like, please think a lot before you become a journalist. Because look, there is, of course, there are smaller organizations, like I said, and of course, there's a lot of good work happening in bigger organizations also in mainstream media. And there are some people who are really committed to the craft or committed to storytelling, and they get by and they're doing their stuff. But financially, it's a really bad situation that we're in. It's not easy to have your salary cut by like 15% for a whole year and not have it back, or it's not easy to live with this constant fear of a layoff, and it's just invariable. It's just happening all the time. Just last month we had the largest newspaper just in the middle of the second wave sack people. The second wave was only beginning, and it was just, again, people let off. And the people who were sorry, I'm sorry, they weren't let off, there was a salary cut. Sorry. So bang in the middle of the second wave, there was a salary cut. This is after they've already had a salary cut last year, and they were expecting appraisals, thinking, okay, that maybe things are better now, and there you have another salary cut. So it's to me, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but to me, I really think you have to really think hard before becoming a journalist. You have to also think hard about the reasons of why you want to do this, because it's going to be hard to do this with the kind of money that a lot of people are making and the kind of financial insecurity. Like, at some point you have to think of whether it's worth it or not. And I don't know.
I mean, that goes back to the diversity issue, because once it's badly paid and erratic, you're either going to get either real rebels who just don't care, or people who are independently wealthy, who have family money or
exactly. And that's a huge problem, because then we're stuck with this diversity problem. Because if you have someone back home to take care of, if you have to send money back home, which happens in a lot of cases, especially for first generation learners, and you often you want to earn to be able to send money back. You won't be able to do that in journalism. And then, like you said, you just have rich people, privileged people like me join the profession. So, even when I started off in journalism, I think it's been 10 years, 11 years now, my father had to pay my rent, because I just couldn't sustain myself with that salary in New Delhi.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't. So, I sustained, I stayed on, and I was able to do that because I had a father who said, okay, I'll pay your rent, don't worry. But how many people can do that, And this is 10 years ago. I mean, of course, there was a whole slowdown happening at that point, but still things are much worse now. So I think, and add to that, if you're unable to tell the stories you want to, if you're somehow stuck in a job where, and this is likely to happen, you're stuck in a job where, your stories are likely to get killed, then it also gets very demotivating. Then you really don't know why you're here. So, sorry, painting a very bleak picture.
This is okay at times. Question from Mark Olu from Kenya, again, one of our journalist fellows, on kind of reflect, how you report on identities, because it's a very complex issue in India in the same way it is in Kenya. If I just read his question out: religion is a touchy issue in India, on top of the deep economic inequalities. When you report on the Bengal violence, you identify victims by their region, political affiliation, e.g. Hindus and BJP supporters, and other media houses do the same. Isn't there a danger that the Indian media is fueling polarizations along these kind of sensitive lines of religion and politics?
Oh, there's no doubt that the Indian media is fueling polarization through, I mean, not in, like I said, like the mainstream news channels and every so what the current government is also very good at, I think one of their prime focus is capturing headlines and setting the media narrative. So they've also pumped in a lot of, like, for example, in West Bengal, 2 channels came up right before the election, just because they were going to peddle the government propaganda there. So just help them during the elections. And so yeah, so because of that, you do have even language press or television news channels in a particular state who will mirror what some of the mainstream channels do for the government in Delhi, basically. With respect to just reporting on what is there on the ground, like when we went there, we saw polarization on the ground. You know, we had people tell us that this is a Hindu area and Muslims will not enter here or vote, or this is a Muslim area and Hindus will not come. I mean, there was one place where there were allegations of voter suppression by Hindus against Muslims. So the thing with us is when we go on ground and when you're hearing these things, you have to relay that back. I mean, I can't censor it and say it's not happening, because polarization is already happening before I've landed there. It's already a polarized entity. So you have to be sensitive about how you report it, and you have to give a context of why this is happening, and you can't blatantly, push what people are saying without providing a context. And this is something that the TV media also does quite a bit. They will amplify the polarization onto a bigger audience without the filters of why it's happening. So if someone has to say something, a Hindu has to say something terrible or a Muslim, or or just basically went out whatever venom there is in him or her, TV media will just relay that as a reality without any filters, and that adds to it. That I agree. So yeah, it's a tricky thing.
Thank you. Another kind of topic about misinformation, where we keep having conversations about misinformation and fake news, and there's always a question of how much should journalists engage with this, because you could spend your whole time dealing with misinformation and never do actually any reporting.
I think there was a research, right, that the truth never nearly ever travels faster.
It doesn't.
Always,
it definitely doesn't. Yeah.
always news which will. Yeah.
Well, there's kind of the light air has flown around the world before truth has got its boots on. So, it will always. But a question from Elizabeth Gampel in Germany, which is that fake news and spread of misinformation is a huge problem in many countries. How are you dealing with it in India, especially during the Corona crisis? At News Laundry in particular, what do you feel a need to kind of try and address it, or do you just do your reporting?
No, because we're News Laundry, we do that. Our focus usually is on misinformation in mainstream news. Okay. So we will report on what the channels are doing, because they have a huge audience again, and they reach out to a lot of people. So we are checking propaganda and fake news in mainstream news, which is really often the fountainhead of a lot of fake news in India, unfortunately. There are websites like Alt News, Boom Live, that are doing a fabulous job of. That is a very hard job what they're doing, because they are checking misinformation online, on WhatsApp, on Facebook, on Twitter, and they're constantly being bombarded by, messages after messages, images after images, doctored messages, fake narratives and stuff like that. So those 2 websites, I think, are really focusing on countering misinformation across platforms. Yeah. At News Laundry, we're not really looking at, like, say, and during coronavirus, there are all kinds of medical misinformation that, again, Alt News is tackling very well, I think. Like, have this concoction and coronavirus will go away, or drink this and you'll be fine, or, pray at a certain time, at a certain day, and you'll not contract the virus, so stuff like that. So Alt News, I think, is doing a very fabulous job of countering all of that on various platforms, because again, in India, WhatsApp is the bigger purveyor of, it's a bigger spreader of, it just spreads faster on WhatsApp. That's where the real danger is.
Can I talk about social media, the role of social media, and in particular, you've talked about the demonization of certain characters on social media, and talking in particular about kind of the Rajput suicides. Could you talk a little bit about kind of, the kind of the suicides, the Rajput suicides? Sorry,
Rajput suicides.
it's after the kind of Rajput, Sushant Singh Rajput.
Oh, Sushant Singh Rajput. Oh my God. Okay, God,
Sorry,
that's
it's like a very difficult way to do it, but
yeah. Okay,
he was he took his own life, and then an actress, Riya Chakraborty, was really kind of vilified on social media for playing a role. And I only ask because we do a lot again on mental health of journalists and on reporting of mental health, and suicide is one of those. The media often has a tendency to say this happened, who's to blame, without accepting that this is a mental illness, and it's like other illnesses, nobody is always to blame.
That was just by far the most, the worst media trials that I have seen in the past 10 years at least, is the worst form of journalism, where most of television news anchors just abdicated basic responsibility of checking facts and doing the bare minimum in terms of checking facts. And how it started was a little bit of social media. So there were these conspiracies happening on social media that maybe it was a suicide, and then using pictures and coming up with vague stories about how the girlfriend was present when this happened. So basically, I mean, not to go into the details because it's a bit confusing for everyone to get here, but he's basically a really popular Bollywood star. He's found in his room hanging. It's a prima facie, it seems like he's died by suicide. And slowly what happens is that you have this one news anchor, Arnab Goswami, on Republic TV, who picks this up, and he's really like it's really like the Fox News, but Fox News on cocaine. It's really like a Fox News into 2000 kind of a channel. And he picks it up on prime time, and then he just runs with it as to who was this and why was he killed, and there's a conspiracy. And he was picking up a lot of the stuff from social media. And soon, I think what anchors realize is there's a lot of interest in it, and that they start getting TRPs out of it, and everyone jumped on that. It was a story. Then everyone who was not reporting on it, or not really, with the exception of 2 or 3 channels, people just jumped on it. And every day it was daying out some salacious detail or the other. And those details would often just come from social media. And it's very interesting. One of the very popular theories of the murder, quote unquote, that was floated around was by this person who wrote a Facebook post. So this was also a time around which a lot of social media, influencers, I don't know if you can call them influencers, on social media. So they put these theories out that, so there's an elaborate story that he wrote on how this was a murder, complete cock and bull, and with a disclaimer that this story can or cannot be true. It could be fiction or it's true. But this news channel, Republic TV, just picks that story up, calls him to the panel, and allows him like 15 minutes of, please tell us what do you know about this murder, quote unquote. So you have someone you picked. So this is a very terrible combination of the worst of social media and the worst of television media, where you have people spouting these inane theories who are brought on, given prime time space, mainstream space, to just talk about, what their theories are. And that happened with a lot of, and that's how this, I think channels were reporting it for almost 3 months. It just sustained over 3 months, purely by the mainstream media picking up on social media conspiracies, one beast feeding the other.
No, I think I want to address that to Elizabeth, kind of about the misinformation. There's the kind of the misinformation that's out there, which is the drink this and it'll protect you from COVID, but there is the media's role in amplifying nonsense on social media.
Absolute nonsense, yeah. And to answer your question, I mean, for me, because I was reporting, I watch a lot of television news for my show. Mentally, this is the first time that I felt really, for me, I mean, you were talking about mental health for reporters also. I felt really overwhelmed by the propaganda that I was consuming. And I really felt defeated. I felt that, okay, there's no way that I can counter this. And you also, at some point, then feel so useless. You feel like, what can you say to counter this mass sea of misinformation that's coming your way? And till today, I think, even though the case is like, classically it's died down because no one needs a distraction right now, or it's not enough to distract anyone right now. Till today, I think if you ask a regular person on the street in India and who are aware of this case, they will still say that, I think that girl, something is up with her. Even if they won't say she murdered him, the perception that she was up to something has just been, it's just normalized. And you'll find the most educated people say that, it's not just a question of literacy or people who buy in propaganda, but everyone, I think a large section of Indian society who's been consuming that would tell you that something was amiss there. And that's the power of TV propaganda.
Thank you. Last question is going to run out of time, which is from me about satire, because you host a terrifically funny show poking fun at the news and politics. What role, you will obviously say, it's tremendously popular amongst the set. Do you think there's space for more? And what kind of feedback or fight back do you get from your work there?
Feedback's usually good. I think so far I've managed to, have people who broadly liked it. I haven't suffered a lot of trolling for it or a lot of backlash for it. I think somewhere people also see, irrespective of the governments you choose, you vote, or you like for, I think our message is really that please question your media. Please question the kind of news that you're getting, because even if you love this government and you're a fan of this government, you need to still have a media that questions it for your sake. So that's really our messaging that we keep driving, that this is really about you wanting a media that serves your interests. And, with the coronavirus pandemic, something like what's happened, it doesn't matter who you voted for. All of us are screwed in this, So, but if you had a media that was holding the government more accountable, things would have been better for all of us. And that's a fact. So that's the message that we drive. And I think a lot of people do get it, irrespective of where their ideologies are. So that's, I've been lucky that way. I think satire is a huge role. And I think I personally took to it because after critiquing the media for a while, I was really fed up with how much can I keep saying the same thing again and again. It's the same set of characters that I'm watching every day. It's the same sort of things that they are saying every day. It's the same formula. And how can I keep this interesting? And how can I keep saying the same thing again and again without sounding boring or too preachy? So satire really helped there. I'm not a satire writer at all, and I am a journalist essentially. But Abhinandan is someone who's written a satire show, so he helps out with that quite a bit, and we all brainstorm and do that together. But the best thing about Indian TV news is that you don't have to write satire. Satire just writes itself, because it's all there on the screen for you to just point at and say, look what's happening on your TV screens. And just one thing I wanted to add, that I think with News Laundry, because we critique the media, we've always tried to not have a very preachy tone or sound too like holier than thou. We want to be able to, and also because journalists are so not used to being critiqued or questioned, we also want to break that, that feeling that this is something that you cannot do, that you can't question. So the moment you get humor in, I think it's very easy to break those barriers of questioning each other, poking fun at each other, poking fun at ourselves sometimes. So humor helps in disarming a lot of people, and a lot of people are more open to, I think, understanding critique when you lace it with a little bit of humor. So that's a learning experience, and it's something that's fun to experiment with.
I think it's a really fascinating model of kind of boosting media literacy and kind of awareness of journalism through satire, and something I'd really like to see tried elsewhere. Manisha, thank you so much for your time and for your honesty.
I hope this was useful, and thank you so much, everyone.
An incredible hour. And next week we have Gustavo Faleros from the Pulitzer Center and the founder of Informa Amazonia, talking about cross-border reporting on environmental issues. So do join us for that. And in the meantime, Manisha, stay safe. All the best to you and your family and your newsroom, and we'll look out for your work. Thank you.
Thank you. Great.
Good. He was still alive.
Oh.
Just a few minutes. But thank you all. And there's a...
Yeah, thank you. That was great.
And you can put your fan on now. Thank you for switching it off. Melting.
Going crazy.